All right. So we have a fun topic today. And it's really your topic. I'm just going to say it right out of the gate. You're very passionate about it, and I love it. I love your passion. And so we're going to talk through original sin versus original blessing.
Yeah, this just absolutely drives me bananas, right? This idea that because of Adam, we're all sinful. It just makes me crazy. And Western Christianity has just really gone in a bad direction with this. And I think that if we could rethink it and kind of free ourselves, it would make a lot of things in life more beautiful and more joyful for those who subscribe. So let's just debunk it. Let's just tear it apart. This is like my favorite thing one of my favorite things to talk about. So,
all right. I'm looking forward to it. I feel like I'm going to learn a lot because I'm definitely far from an expert on this subject. So let's start with the concept of original sin. Walk me through that a little bit, because I just have a broad, of course, I grew up in a church. I studied Calvinism and all kinds of things, but I don't think I've devoted as much thought to it as you have. So let's talk first about, this whole foundation of this concept of original sin.
Yes. All right. So first and foremost, it is called the doctrine of original sin. And it's called the doctrine of original sin because it's not really biblical. You're not going to find it in the Bible. And it is theological in its construct, right? Which means a theologian a long time ago decided that this was what the Bible was saying without real evidence and ignoring all the evidence to the contrary. So we'll talk about that. But the doctrine says that because of Adam's sin, we are all innately sinful now, right? We all carry that sin. He has transmitted that sin to us. So that's what the idea of the doctrine of original sin is all about. That's why we need salvation. That's why, Roman Catholic guilt, right? On and on and on. A lot of pieces are touched by this idea. So that's what it's all about.
So the words original sin do not appear in the Bible, correct?
They do not. And sin definitely does, right? The concept
of course,
sin,
yeah.
Yes. Talk about that separately. But, this idea that we're flawed from birth, that we're innately sinful, that's not in the Bible. That's not in there. That's not what we're told at all, right?
I was intrigued by this, so I did a little bit of research, and there are certain, passages in the Bible that allude to this in terms of referencing, this idea of having some seed of sin or some level of being born with sin, etc. Like there are definitely some verses that reference it obliquely or, not as directly. But then it sounds like what happened was those kernels were taken and morphed into this kind of separate theology.
Yeah. And so if you break it down and you start with New Testament, right? Jesus does not ever directly teach the idea of original sin, right? So you could, to your point about some oblique references, depending on your interpretation, depending on how you choose to, I believe the word is inspired, not literal. So depending on what we see the world, as we are, not as it is. So, if you want to construe it, you can misconstrue it. But he never directly teaches. In fact, what does he teach? Love and mercy. He says that we are blessed, that we are the light of the world, right? So there's no direct teaching on this idea of, being born into sin and carrying Adam's sin, right? And if you look at the Old Testament, they definitely talk about the concept of sin, but it's not original sin. Sin in that context is falling short of the mark, right? Falling short of the glory of God, that kind of idea. And even the Cain and Abel example, right? They don't condemn Cain or ascribe his poor choice to Adam. Right? It is much more discussed in the context of he made it was his choice. And so you don't really see that idea through the Old Testament. So, and I would say I don't consider myself an expert. I know enough to be dangerous. So certainly if anyone's listening and they want to jump in the chat or the comments, please feel free, love to have the dialogue. So it's not New Testament. It's not Old Testament, right? So you know, it's a uniquely Western Christian idea. Western Christianity is really, the torchbearer of this idea. And we talked earlier about, it's a theological construct and a theologian came up with it. Well, that theologian is Saint Augustine in the 4th century. So I don't know if and he's a pretty popular guy. And he obviously had some beautiful things to say, but he brought this idea of original sin forward. I don't know if you're familiar with him or you have a pro or con opinion on him, but
I do not have strong feelings about him. I have some vague familiarity, but that's about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, he was a prolific writer, a theologian. And, like I said, he has some beautiful doctrine, but he is famous or one of the things he's really well known for. He wrote a book called Confessions, like, his personal confessions. And, he basically said, I embrace Jesus. I love Jesus, but not all the way yet. I'm having a lot of fun. I'm not ready to just completely commit. Right. And in his confessions, he literally wrote, I was foul and I liked it. Okay. So he was quite the player. Okay. Augustine or Augustine, however you say it, he was quite the player. He was known for being quite sexually promiscuous. Right. And he liked that lifestyle. So, he didn't fully commit himself to the Christian way because he wasn't, he waited till he was later and older in life. Right. Before he changed his ways basically. And, not stories, but books that are written about him say that he had a lot of personal struggle, with how he behaved and reconciling his behavior with his beliefs, and so I think he was looking for a scapegoat, to a certain degree. I'm not a bad guy. I inherited Adam's sin, right? So his personal philosophy and how he chose to live his life is sort of one factor of what affected him. Another factor is, he was influenced by the Platonic thought, the Neoplatonism of the time. Plato it was 3rd century, but, his followers were carrying on his thinking. And I think one of the damages Plato did to us is he had sort of a hierarchy of being, and he separated matter from spirit, right? So spirit is good, but matter is bad. And so it kind of funnels into this whole, our bodies are bad, matter is, the goal is to get out of our body, eschatology, this idea that things aren't going to be great until we get to heaven, but just sort of splitted things out and created this kind of dualism. So when you think about, or what's been written or said about, Augustine, that was another really important factor for him, right? So thinking about, okay, my body's bad and Adam was bad and he sinned and I'm doing all this stuff. It just sort of was a confluence of ideas that came together. And then the third and final piece that's, attributed to this doctrine of original sin is his translation of the Bible. It said basically that in Adam, we all sinned versus Adam sinned. It kind of put those two things together. He was, I think, reading a Latin translation of a Greek translation, so you can get into some slippery slopes when it comes to translations. But, and so, that was sort of the trifecta for him. And he just created this idea of original sin and started talking about it and popularizing it. And, he was a well-known guy, so it got a lot of momentum. And I want to read just literally his quote here, because this was his statement. By yielding to the tempter, Adam and Eve committed a personal sin, but this sin affected the human nature that they would then transmit in a fallen state. So he wrote that. That's not biblical, and that's the idea of where original sin comes from, and this doctrine of original sin.
So, I mean, fair to say he had a very personal lens, and then he pushed that viewpoint, and it was adopted and people ran with it. And that's how it really, manifested in terms of what we've seen historically in Western Christianity, and also to date to a certain extent.
Absolutely. You still hear it. I mean, I'm a good Lutheran girl, and Martin Luther fell subject to that. He believed that as well. And so, it really, it really, Richard Rohr called it the first mistake Christianity made, and that it caused this cosmic rupture, right? And it derailed us from original blessing and put original sin in the spotlight. And it's, it's important to, I think it's worth noting that, again, Western Christianity uniquely holds this idea. Judaism doesn't. Eastern Orthodox Christianity doesn't. Anglicans, Episcopals, Quakers, Unitarians, Celts, even the Mormons. Here's what the Mormons say. We believe that men will be punished for their own sins. That's a whole nother topic. And not for Adam's transgressions, right? So there's a modified interpretation of the doctrine or a downright rejection of it in most other, Christian traditions. And then Buddhism, Hinduism, Islamism, Native American, they don't have that concept whatsoever. Doesn't exist. So it is
Right.
uniquely a Western Christian burden, I would say, and I think a lot of people carry around.
Yeah, and I think maybe almost subliminally in some cases, because it's been so ingrained in, specifically, I think from the standpoint of like how the United States was shaped and some of the early folks who were integral to that and how we think about ourselves as a nation. I think it's especially, it feels like it's a brick in the foundation. And so some people are not, probably don't sit and think about it, but on some level, it is part of their, DNA or makeup or consideration. I will say, though, that has evolved over time. I looked a little bit at some research in terms of, what do the stats say today in terms of how do people believe, right? So only about 27% of U.S. adults affirm original sin. And this is based on a study that was actually done called the American Worldview Inventory 2023 through 2025. So it was published just this year. And it comes out of, I think it's the Arizona Christian University, George Barna. And so he does a lot of research around trends, religious trends, with the viewpoint of, for him, this is concerning, right? For him, this is a negative that so few people believe that. 73% believe humans are good, and that's also reaffirmed by a 2023 survey by the Cultural Research Center, which found the exact same number, 73%. So you have two, pretty divergent sources that found, statistically a similar result. And I think really interesting because, this is a shift, from where it used to be. More folks used to be as early as as recent as the 90s, predominantly more folks in the U.S. believed in this concept of original sin. So I will say it does seem to be unwinding a bit, right? Which is cause for alarm for people who have been proponents of it, but clearly in your viewpoint, probably a positive.
Yeah, well, just think about how many people walk around saying I'm spiritual and I'm not religious. They've walked away from what I humbly think is some beautiful ritual and community and fellowship because it's burdened with stuff like original sin, and so I think it creates schisms. I think it creates conflict within people, how you're raised versus what you believe in your heart, what's happening in the world. If you believe that we're bad and we fell out of the garden, then we don't have to take care of nature. Like it sort of cascades, how we treat people. The long arm of this idea, I think, still kind of exists in our collective unconscious in a way, especially, right, as Americans. You mentioned, I think, is it Pilgrim's Pride? I'm not good at my Puritan history, but their big takeaway message was, in Adam's fall, we all fall, something to that effect. You're just like, oh, for crying out loud. Do you know what I mean? Like,
definitely part of the Puritan tradition from the things that I read just before we decided to sit down and talk about this, because I had to do a crash course. I was like, I haven't thought about this in a long time. I also looked for any statistics around, are religious people more likely to be charitable, benevolent, do good works. And the findings are inconclusive. In some cases, studies have found like they're more like religious people are more likely to be charitable on the days that they attend a worship service, but otherwise are about the same as non-religious people. Non-religious folks are driven more by, this general sense of, wanting to live in a functioning society, wanting to treat their neighbors as they would treat themselves, but not tied to a religious tradition. So it's more human centered. So there wasn't anything conclusive on that. I was curious, are religious folks, do they do more good works in the world? And it tends to be a little bit different. The only thing that was true was in their own groups, yes. So if I perceive you as part of my in-group, whatever religious affiliation I have, I am more likely to be generous to you, but not universally generous.
Yeah. So, well, I think there's a psychology of the tribe at play there. I think as human beings, I think, our tribe should be 50, maybe 100 people that we can get to know, that we can care about, that we can support. And now we live in this global world. I've read studies on this. It's overwhelming. When there's a child on the other side of the world that's suffering, who doesn't want to help? But how exactly? And how do I do it consistently? And so to your point, I think, our nature is to be good, and we want to be good to each other. It's just hard. It's hard today to figure out how to do it. And I certainly don't think being a religious person makes you a good person. I think there is a lot of evidence to the contrary, right? In both directions. I think that is a myth. In fact, I think some of, just the opposite. Hypocrisy runs rampant everywhere. No place is safe from the hypocrisy.
We're all human and fallible, right? That's one thing that I find interesting when people say to me, well, they're a good Christian person, as like a proof point in terms of someone's integrity or, goodness, inherent goodness. And as someone who is not religious, I always find that interesting because I know a lot of very good people who are not Christian, and I know some people who are not so great who are Christian. And so I don't think that's necessarily a proof point, right? But it's more of like, how do you apply, your foundational morals and beliefs in the world, and what actions do you take, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to get to this idea of, because I really want to talk about original blessing, but I'm going to give you 2 more studies before we get there.
All right.
Just so that we can talk about, kind of lead into it. So are we wired? So I looked for just behavioral science studies on this topic. And one of them was around selfishness and moral decision making. And it was a 2001 study. We can put links to all this stuff in the show notes. But it was an fMRI investigation of emotional engagement and moral judgment. It was published in Science magazine. And the finding was that when people make moral decisions that pit self-interest against harm to others, brain imaging shows both emotional and rational brain areas are activated, revealing internal conflicts between our selfish impulses and our moral reasoning. So literally a neurological basis for this internal conflict we have when our ideals meet our own best interest, right?
Yeah.
So there's some meaty stuff there. But then leading to this idea of original blessing, there was another study in 2004 called The Functional Architecture of Human Empathy. And I love this one. Also using fMRI scans. I love it when science gives us these insights because I love that. Researchers found that observing someone else in pain activates similar brain regions as experiencing pain oneself. So this mirroring is a biological basis that we have an innate capacity for empathy. It's there.
Love it.
It's wired into us. But if there's also this internal conflict. So let's talk about original blessing.
We have to talk about what you just shared because that's amazing.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Because we could eventually we'll do a whole topic on Jung and collective unconsciousness, and Joseph Campbell speaks about this a lot. I mean, the levels of consciousness, right? How many? There's like 6 or 7. There's waking, sleeping, dreaming, meditative consciousness, cosmic consciousness, and then the ultimate consciousness, which is unitive, right? Where we realize we are all just one. We are all part of the same I'll call it divinity, life force, whatever is appropriate. And as you evolve, as you move through this consciousness, right? You could even argue that Adam and Eve falling out of the garden was an increase in consciousness, understanding, right? Good versus, maybe that was bad for us, another show, but just evolving your consciousness. And when you realize, I think what's happening in the brain when you feel someone else's pain is you're acknowledging, like, deep inside you, we're the same person, we're part of the same life force. And you can't shut it off. It's why, when you hear these stories of, somebody was on the Golden Gate Bridge and they were about to jump and somebody just lunges for them, they put their own life at risk to try and save somebody, knowing they could very well die. Well, they have like broken through to this higher level of consciousness. And, I read an interview afterwards. They're like, what? You had a job and a family and a life and a kids, like what? And their answer is like, in that moment, we were the same. Like my life was his life, right? Like, and that is such a shocking break from the way we normally live reality. But when you open yourself up, it's there. So a digression, but I think really, really interesting what you shared, and how it speaks to the different levels of consciousness that we as humans have.
Yeah, you definitely see that kindness to others, support, especially in dramatic instances, like you mentioned. What was it, Mr. Rogers, that said, "Look for the helpers"? That's been on circulating on social media incessantly. I love Mr. Rogers. The documentary about him made me sob. I loved it so much.
I don't know if
I was
ever
like,
saw
we
it.
need, oh, you have to watch it. We need
Yeah, I
more
guess I have
Mr.
to.
Rogers in this world is what we need. But,
Um,
those dramatic instances where people almost don't even have time to think. They act
that's right.
instinctually, and they, try to help other people
Yeah.
in this. So original
Okay.
blessing, this idea, because, I did some research on this, and then also this idea of just neutrality, right? We're neither good nor bad. We're like a blank slate. So let's talk about those two things.
Okay. Well, I think we're good. That's my humble opinion.
Okay.
Happy to discuss, in detail with anyone else. Okay, so let's talk about original blessing, and I think that really the pivotal foundational book on this is by Matthew Fox. He's a theologian, and he wrote a book called Original Blessing. And Richard Rohr talks about it a lot. There's a lot of people that are speaking about it, but those would be the two sources I would send people to for a more educated, more articulate explanation. But basically, the idea of original blessing is that we're not born sinful. We're born blessed, right? We're born whole and we're born good. And the support for that is biblical, right? So if you think about, we were just talking about Adam and the fall, that's Genesis chapter 3. Well, if you paid attention to Genesis chapter 1, God says it's good, right? He says 7 times in chapter 1 that not only is it good, all the different things that he has created. I've got my list here. Let me see if I can find it. Light is good, land and vegetation, the sky, the birds, the sea creatures, land animals, and humans, all good. And then on the 7th day, it is very good, right? So he's declared it good, right? He didn't declare it sinful. From the very beginning, we're blessed, we're whole, and we have that within us. The kingdom of God is within us, right? So if you ground yourself in that, and then you think, and I know we're getting heavy into Bible stuff here, so which is not normally our path, but if you think about some of the scripture, I just pulled out a few examples. In Psalms, God tells us we're fearfully and wonderfully made, right? Not nastily and sinfully. In Jeremiah, he tells us, before you were born, I consecrated you. You're holy, right? You're holy. We are the light of the world, we're told in Matthew. In Corinthians, we're told God's Spirit dwells within us. And if we believe that we are part of this divinity, this divine life force, and we're made in that image, how could we be anything but? Right? How could we be anything but? So that is the idea of original blessing, right? That is the counter idea. And I have to give a shout out to Pelagius. anybody who loves their theologians. He was the counter voice to Augustine, but even back then it was the cult of personality, and Augustine won, and Pelagius was shunned. So if you want to read more, Pelagius is a good source for that as well. But that's the idea, right? It is an affirmation of our innate goodness, that we are good. And so that's just beautiful.
Yeah, well, and I think interesting in that, clearly we have signs of, we have innumerable instances or examples on a daily basis of people acting in ways that are not good. But what we're talking about is this foundation
Yes.
that then your agency is built on.
Yes.
You have the agency to make decisions that are,
Yes.
harmful or beneficial to yourself or others. But where do you start is basically what we're discussing.
Absolutely. And it doesn't mean that we don't sin. I hate the word sin. It's just loaded with so much baggage, but let's just use that word. And if you take the more Jewish perspective on it, it just means falling short, falling short of the glory of God. We all have agency. We can make our own choices, and to your point, do I choose to be selfish some days, or do I choose to be altruistic? And do I sin? Of course I do. Do I fall short? Absolutely. But that doesn't mean I'm innately sinful. And you think about all the people that are incarcerated in this country. We have more people in prisons in this country than I think any other country in the world, by a staggering amount. And you just think about the institutionalized badness, and you can make a better choice tomorrow. Anybody can choose to your point, we have agency.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, I mean, it shows up in the world in so many ways, and that's a really great example where if you either have a mindset of punishment, or you have a mindset of rehabilitation. I actually had a debate about this with my friend who's Mormon, and or he would say LDS. And, he is a strong proponent of rehabilitation and has actually done programs at prisons. And it was a really interesting discussion because, it very much shapes his worldview, right? That there's this opportunity for people to change their lives.
Yeah. Well, I think it changes if you just imagine as a human that you are looking out, your cosmology is either shaded by I'm sinful or I'm blessed. And if you lean into the I'm blessed, it just naturally promotes gratitude and joy. And if you come at your life from that perspective, it's where, there's a cliche, but I think it's true, God's for you, not against you. The world is for you, not against you. It's just fundamentally how you go through your life. I just think it's a path we were intended to be on, not that life is not hard and we don't have hardships and there's not heartbreak, but, being grateful to be alive, being grateful for the people, being grateful for the planet. Like, let's not destroy it, like it's a gift. It's all good and it's all blessed. And, I especially, and I don't have, my thoughts aren't super cogent on this yet, but I think it affects women a lot more than it affects men. We have this like apology syndrome. I'm sorry, as if we're bad, like there's just this less than mentality. And certainly I think that's, theology and culture colliding. We've kind of created some of that in the culture, but to get up every day and realize I am in the garden. This is the garden. I'm alive.
Well, if you're going to open the feminist door, I'll walk right through it.
I'm
going to, because, in the Christian tradition, that's too broad. It's too broad. Some people have interpreted it in a way that women are the source of the original sin because Eve is the one who tempted Adam, right? And that is so ingrained in the way women are viewed. And the need to control women, etc. So I agree with you. I feel like in that bubble of people who are subscribed to this theory, women are clearly associated as the instigator of original sin.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that's because it was all men who wrote it. And I think that goes back. I think that goes back to your original point, in terms of interpretation, right? Translation and interpretation. And this idea that, do you take the text literally, or not? Or do you even recognize who shaped it and the tool, right? It's God's. If you want to subscribe to the belief that it's God's word, it's still passing through a tool, and that tool is imperfect, and it's a
Right.
person, and
Yeah.
predominantly, almost exclusively, it's a man.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love that you went there. I was hoping that you would. And, it's so funny because, I love the irony of Augustine, in my humble opinion, is he blames Adam for his transgressions. And he got that from Adam, who blamed that on Eve, who then they both blamed it on poor snake, right? And in most mythologies and cultures around the world, snakes are a symbol of life, right? They're the circle. They shed their skin, their rebirth. Only in our culture is a snake. Ooh, a snake, right? Like the snake is the devil, the snake is the evil tempter. And so there's a lot of passing the buck. There's a lot of, just blaming others. And yes, I think that is a biblical foundation that culturally the patriarchy has definitely used and beaten into us, for
Yeah.
sure. And so just embracing your blessedness and your holiness as women, come on, you
It's
know?
very threatening, evidently.
Evidently, right? Right?
Right. Yeah.
And empowering though. So, I think
Yes.
I
Yes.
saw something funny. It was Will Ferrell. He was giving a speech somewhere. I think it was recently. And he just basically said, come on, guys, we've blown it. Let's just give the world to the women. Like we have totally messed it all up. Let's just give it to them. It was hilarious.
Yeah, there's a whole Avett Brothers song that's kind of based on that same idea, but it's almost like it's a where we currently are, right? They wrote it as if like, okay, here we go. It's time for the women to take control. Unfortunately, we're seeing kind of the opposite of
Yeah.
that recently,
Yeah.
right? Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. And even, beyond kind of the place, the cast that women have been put into here, you just think about the war that's going on. And this is a horrible oversimplification, right? But if we all embraced the goodness, then that would eliminate a lot of conflict, I think, humbly, right? Like, I think there's I'm right and you're wrong. There's groups, there's clashes, we need to be superior here, or, we're right here and you're wrong there. So it plays itself out in gender, but it plays itself out in culture. It plays itself out in politics, you
for
know,
sure.
just walking around thinking that I'm part of the good group, you're a part of the bad group. What we struggle with inside, we project outside, right? So your behavioral science, I struggle with my own selfish needs or altruistic needs. Okay, I think there's a way to help transcend that, in the idea of original blessing.
Yeah. So we've been super deep on the Christianity side on this topic, but you brought this up, cultural and historical context makes a big difference, right? So, both of us were raised in the Western Christian tradition to a certain extent, or have experienced it in our lifetimes. I was raised in it. You adopted it a little bit later in life. But you've also, been read deeply in terms of Buddhism, and Buddhism sees human nature as inherently pure, but clouded by ignorance, which is a, a very different, fundamentally different take on the
Absolutely.
challenge, right? This
Absolutely.
this like internal push and pull, in terms of how we make decisions, that are beneficial or harmful, and what leads to those decisions, right? And so this idea of ignorance or suffering versus sin,
Mhm.
feels like a fundamentally different proposition, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. In a lot of the Eastern thought, and again, speaking in generalities, divinity is like it's like divine energy, right? And it comes through different channels. And God tells Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita, all paths lead to me. Right? Pick your path. They all lead to me, and it is this beautiful, positive energy, and it's less personified, right? Which is certainly another conversation, but it is pure and it is beautiful and it is It is good. And then in, Buddhism, suffering and attachment, right? Attachment is what leads to suffering. And those are some of the ignorances, right? And the mote in the eye, if you will, that obscure the goodness, the original goodness. So
Yeah. It's all fascinating. But I do think it's interesting because, we have previously discussed some of the unifying themes across religions, right? The golden rule is represented pretty much in every major religion, etc. But this is something that is very distinctly Western Christianity. So,
yeah, we made a mistake. We made a
mhm.
mistake, and hey, that's okay. We're not perfect, but let's just fix it. Let's just fix it. Let's just talk about it.
Yeah, and I think it'll be, I mean, given that there is this trend of people moving away from it or having a more balanced or complex view around it, even if they are, Christian, or even in a denomination that officially subscribes to original sin. So, like the Southern Baptist Convention, it's still a plank, but they have modified their language around it, over the last few decades, so that it is less absolute. And so, I think that trend is interesting to watch and also indicative of, people having access to other viewpoints, maybe, that moderate, what they may even be told on a weekly basis in their church, right? I don't know anyone that attends a church that believes 100% in every single thing that's a tenet of that religion or that denomination or even comes from that pulpit, right?
Mm-hmm.
People have the ability to make their own decisions, and most of us, I don't want to say cherry pick because that seems like a negative, but
No issue with it.
we subscribe to the pieces that make the most sense to us, right? That fit what resonates, for us specifically. So I don't know. It's a meaty topic, but I do think to your point, like you see it play out, politically, et cetera. And it goes back to this idea of, we talked about belief in our last episode, or meaning, and I made the case for whether you truly, believe that meaning exists or it's a construct that you create, et cetera. You can't argue with the fact that it's beneficial, right? So on a very utilitarian level,
Mm-hmm.
it's very
Yeah.
beneficial for you to feel like there is meaning. Similarly, it's very easy to be jaded about the fact that we're all just inherently sinful and we're starting from this negative, that we have to climb out of. But how much better is it? How much better is the world if we believe that we have this original blessing? You know?
Yeah, I 1,000% agree with that. And, you know, I do agree that it's one of the reasons people have left the church. And what I find so fascinating is I completely understand it. You know, I participate because I love ritual, right? But it's not an every Sunday thing for me by any stretch, but I really, really love the ritual of it. But even the people who leave, they come back their own way, right? They figure it out, they put it together. And I think that speaks very strongly to that divine spark in us. Like it's a part of who we are. It is our core. And most people can't ignore it completely. They somehow want to define it for themselves. They want to have it in their life, whatever shape or form that looks like. I think
Mm-hmm.
it's just fundamental to our humanity, this divine connection, this longing for divinity, to feel the meaning, to express it, and I think that's beautiful. I don't think
Yeah.
there's anything wrong with that. And I also think that's why a lot of the Eastern religions got a foothold here. I mean, you want to go to a sermon where you're told that you're sinful and you need to be saved? Or do you want to hear about how, the divine energy is beautiful and positive, and you're a part of that. You have a piece of that. Who's not going to gravitate to the latter? You know.
Right. Yeah.
So
From an internal, self perception standpoint, and then from an external standpoint, walking through the world expecting the worst of people or walking through the world expecting the best of people. And in both cases, hopefully understanding that people are very complex. But that initial expectation shapes your worldview in pretty much every way.
100%. I mean, think about how we raise our kids. What cosmology do we impart to them about the world? And so I think it touches, it touches every aspect, of who we are and how we move and what we do. And, yeah.
Yes.
100%.
Well, and even marriage counselors, I mean, if there's one thing, if you've ever been to a marriage counseling session, assume positive intent, or even leadership or organizational manuals or whatever.
Yeah.
Assume positive intent is like the one thing that almost everyone's heard.
Yeah.
Assume that this other person is coming from a good place.
Well,
because that's a much more helpful place to start.
It is a much more helpful place to start. However, I do find people are complex, right?
For sure.
I've never met anyone who's all good or all bad. However, I have met people who only want to show me their bad side. That said, I tell my kids, I think it started with, donating to homeless people, or I can't even remember the first time it came up. And they were like, well, Mom, they're not going to use that money for anything good. I'm like, it doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is my intention, right? So don't worry. It's like, I'm only accountable and responsible for my intention. And if I believe that I am part of the divinity, I am blessed and I'm good, then how am I going to behave? And I don't have to worry about. That's for somebody else, what they do with my intention, and, that's another thing that meditation has really helped me with is I don't nearly as much react to the person sitting across the table from me. It still happens. And I know you've seen it happen. So I'm getting better slowly, but I try and come from that place of what's my intention. Right.
Yeah.
And just kind of push that out. And, we joke about Sacredish. That's why there's an ish on the end. Don't get it right all the time, right? Don't see it right all the time. Don't, process it correctly all the time, but slouching towards Bethlehem, right? Trying every day.
Yes, absolutely. I love it. All right. Well, and I think it's important to note because there are a lot of meaty topics that we want to tackle. Obviously, this one, we're swinging for the big ones first here. I love it. Meaning, original sin, all these things. But important to note that we are seekers. So these are topics that, one or both of us have been very passionate about. We've probably done some research. We've thought about them, etc. We're not here to preach.
That's right. Yeah. Am I preachy? Am I being a little preachy today?
No, you're not being preachy, but I just want to be super clear about it, about the fact that we're not showing up with all the answers, right?
Yeah, well, 100, I mean, absolutely. However, if I got to preach one thing, it would be original blessing. If I could have a soapbox to preach, this would be all I preached. But it's not about preaching. I believe everybody has to answer their own call. Everybody has their own relationship with the universe, with God, whatever is appropriate, and answer your own call and follow your own path. Follow your bliss, right? I just want to talk about mine. It's just my favorite thing to talk about. So.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, certainly not a topic that I've devoted a ton of thought to in many, many years. I will say that.
Good. Because you don't need to. You've processed it and you've moved on, sister. That's great.
Well, I don't know about that, but it was nice to revisit in this context because I do think that sometimes, I have like a skeptic's brain, so I think that this idea of original blessing at first blush can sound almost naive to some people because people are complex. But I think you put a really nice point on it in terms of how to think about that in the context of, your own intention and other, you can't control other people, but also, kind of this foundational idea of, we all know the stories of people who have, been rehabilitated in prison. We know stories about people who have turned their lives around, et cetera. Like there's no shortage of examples of people who have made poor decisions as part of their own agency, but are not inherently bad people.
Right. Just like me. I make poor decisions all the time. Luckily, Luckily, it's not who I am, right? It's not
Right.
who I am. It's not who I am.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
Well, I love it and look forward to learning even more.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us on Sacredish. Hopefully this got you stirred up. Let us know. Feel free to reach out. Bye.